In the bustling streets of Boston, Michael Jung drove his taxi through the harshest winter in decades. On a snow-filled evening when the city shut down, he chose to help a stranded family far beyond his usual route. That single decision would transform not just his struggling taxi business but revolutionize transportation access across New England in ways he never imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Michael Jung stared at his taxi's meter earnings for the day. Another disappointment. The harsh Boston winter had been brutal for independent taxi drivers like him, with ride-sharing apps taking over and mounting bills at home. His daughter Wei's college applications were due soon, and his mother's medical expenses weren't getting any cheaper. The city that once provided a comfortable living for taxi drivers now seemed to be squeezing them out, one fare at a time. The weather forecast on his dashboard radio warned of an incoming blizzard, the worst in 10 years. Most drivers had already called it quits, heading home early to avoid the storm. But Michael couldn't afford to, not with Wei's dream school application fee due next week, and certainly not with his mother's specialist appointment coming up. The thought of disappointing either of them weighed heavier than the snow accumulating on his windshield. "You should head home soon, Michael," Linda Wu called out from her diner's doorway as he picked up his usual evening coffee. The steam rose from the cup, a stark contrast to the icy wind whipping through the streets. "Storm's going to be nasty tonight. They're saying it might be worse than the blizzard of '78. Michael managed a tired smile, his weathered face reflecting both exhaustion and determination. "Just a few more hours, Linda. Bills won't pay themselves." He took a sip of the coffee. Linda always made it extra strong for him, knowing his long hours. The warmth spread through his chest, a temporary comfort against the growing cold. His phone buzzed, a message from Wei. "Dad, Mom's coughing got worse. Do we have enough for her prescription refill? The pharmacy called about the payment." Another buzz followed. "Don't worry about my application fees. Maybe I can try community college instead." Michael's heart sank. His daughter was brilliant. Straight A's since elementary school, president of the science club, and volunteer work every weekend. Community college wasn't bad, but it wasn't what she deserved. Between his mother's medication, Wei's college applications, and the taxi's maintenance, something would have to give. He remembered his late father's words. "A Jung never gives up no matter how hard the wind blows." Those words had carried him through 15 years of driving Boston's streets, through his wife's passing, through every hardship life had thrown at him. The evening grew darker as snow began falling heavily. Michael's fellow driver Kevin Park pulled up beside him at their usual spot near the train station. Through the swirling snow, Michael could see the concern on his friend's face. They'd started driving taxis together back when business was good, before the apps, before the economy turned. "Going home, Michael? This storm's no joke. Highway patrol's talking about closing the bridges. You should too." Kevin's voice crackled through the slightly opened window. Michael shook his head, watching the snow collect on his wipers. "Need to make a quota first. Maybe the weather will bring in some desperate customers. Besides, someone needs to be out here for emergencies." Kevin's face showed concern. "Your mother needs you alive more than she needs the money. But I know better than to argue with Jung. At least keep your radio on Channel 6. They're broadcasting storm updates." He drove off, leaving Michael alone in the increasingly deserted streets. As night fell and the blizzard intensified, Michael's taxi crawled through snow-covered roads. His phone's weather app flashed warnings. "Extreme weather alert. Stay indoors. All non-emergency vehicles are advised to seek immediate shelter." The streets were empty now, streetlights creating eerie halos in the swirling snow. Even the usual night owls, the partygoers, the late-shift workers, the urban adventurers, had sought refuge from the storm. He was about to give up when his dispatch radio crackled to life, static cutting through the howling wind. "Any units near Brighton? Family stranded at Tech Park. No other drivers responded. Repeat. Family stranded at Brighton Tech Park. Emergency situation." Michael checked his GPS. Brighton was far, at least a 40-minute drive in these conditions, and in this weather, it would be a challenging drive. His mother's face flashed in his mind. He had promised to bring her evening medication. The clock showed 8:45 p.m. The pharmacy would close at 9:30. But something about the word family made him reach for the radio. He thought of his own family, of times when they had needed help, of strangers who had shown kindness when it mattered most. Unit 247 responding, en route to Brighton. ETA uncertain due to weather conditions. As he navigated through the treacherous conditions, Michael questioned his decision. The snow was getting deeper, and his taxi's wheels struggled for traction. But 15 years of driving Boston streets had taught him every back road and shortcut. He knew which streets the plows hit first, which corners to avoid when ice formed, which routes stayed passable even in the worst weather. Tonight, he would need every bit of that knowledge. When he finally reached the address, he found a man in an expensive but weather-inappropriate suit waving frantically. Behind him, through the swirling snow, Michael could make out a woman and two small children huddled in a broken-down Tesla, its sleek design useless against nature's fury. The contrast between the luxury vehicle and their current predicament struck Michael. Money couldn't always buy safety. The man rushed to Michael's window, his face red from the cold. "Thank God you came. We've been stuck here for hours. Our car's battery died and the emergency services were overwhelmed. We need to get to Cambridge Hospital. My mother-in-law had a stroke. The doctors say." His voice cracked with emotion. Michael saw the worry in the man's eyes, the same look he had when his own mother first fell ill. Without hesitation, he stepped out into the biting cold to help the family with their luggage. What Michael didn't know, as he carefully helped the shivering children into his warm taxi, was that this seemingly routine pickup would set in motion events that would change not just his life, but the lives of countless others. Sometimes the biggest turning points come disguised as ordinary moments, and on this snow-filled night, Michael Jang was about to discover exactly that. Inside the taxi, Michael cranked up the heat as the Anderson family settled in. The two children, Lucy and Tom, were shivering despite their winter coats. Their mother, Emma, held them close while Robert Anderson made urgent calls on his phone, his voice tight with worry as he tried to reach the hospital. "The roads to Cambridge Hospital are terrible," Michael said, carefully navigating through the worsening storm. "But I know a few shortcuts through Somerville that the plows always clear first." Years of driving through Boston's worst winters had taught him every back route and side street that stayed passable even in blizzards like this. His taxi's wheels spun momentarily as they climbed a small hill. Michael could hear Emma whispering comfort to her children in the back seat. The scene reminded him of nights spent caring for Wei when she was their age, during the years after his wife's passing. Those had been hard times, but they'd taught him the importance of staying calm in crisis. "Your mother-in-law?" Michael said, eyes focused on the treacherous road ahead. "Has she been sick long?" He adjusted the defroster, fighting to maintain visibility through the increasingly heavy snowfall. Robert paused his phone calls, running a hand through his snow-dampened hair. "No. It was sudden. Emma's mom was fine yesterday watching the kids. Then this morning." His voice trailed off. Emma wiped tears from her eyes, trying to stay strong for the children. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears. Michael thought of his own mother, probably worried sick about him being out in this weather. He'd missed bringing her evening medication, but he knew she'd understand. She always said helping others was in their family's blood. That philosophy had guided him through countless difficult decisions over the years. The taxi's radio crackled with updates about road closures. Several main routes to Cambridge were already shut down. The dispatcher's voice grew increasingly urgent with each announcement. Michael's experience told him they had maybe an hour before even his secret shortcuts would become impassable. He'd seen storms like this before. They had a way of shutting down the city completely if you didn't stay ahead of them. "Dad," Lucy's small voice piped up from the back. "Will Grandma be okay?" Her brother Tom clutched her hand, both children showing a maturity beyond their years in the face of crisis. Robert turned to his daughter, struggling to find the right words. Michael caught his expression in the rearview mirror. It was the same look he'd worn when trying to explain to Young Wei why her mother wasn't coming home from the hospital. Some conversations with children were impossible to prepare for. "Your grandmother is very strong," Michael found himself saying, his voice steady and reassuring. "And sometimes when we're worried about someone we love, the best thing we can do is believe in them." He saw Emma's grateful glance in the mirror, understanding the gift of hope his words had offered. The family fell silent, touched by the unexpected wisdom from their taxi driver. Michael noticed Tom had stopped crying, now watching the snow through the window with curious eyes. The boy's resilience reminded him of Wei at that age, finding wonder even in difficult moments. As they navigated through narrow back streets, Robert tried to make small talk, perhaps to distract himself from worry. His expensive watch caught the streetlight as he checked the time again. "How long have you been driving taxis, Mr. Zhang?" 15 years, Michael replied, carefully turning onto a less-traveled road. The taxi's tires crunched through fresh snow, finding traction where other vehicles might have faltered. "Started right after my wife passed. Needed flexible hours to care for my daughter and mother." He'd learned every inch of Boston during those years, turning necessity into expertise. Emma's eyes met his in the mirror, filled with understanding. "You raised your daughter alone? That must have been incredibly challenging." "Yes, Wei. She's 17 now, applying to colleges." Michael smiled proudly, then added softly, "If we can figure out the fees." The admission slipped out before he could stop it, perhaps because there was something about this family that felt trustworthy despite their obvious wealth. The taxi's heater hummed steadily as they passed abandoned vehicles on the main roads. Michael's phone buzzed again, another message from Wei. "Dad, where are you? The storm's getting worse. Mom's worried. Please be safe." The concern in her messages was palpable, but so was her understanding of who her father was. "Your family must be worried about you being out in this weather," Emma observed, noticing his glance at the phone. Her voice carried genuine concern, unexpected from a stranger. Michael nodded, navigating around a stuck delivery truck. "Sometimes we have to help others even if it means making our own families worry a little. My mother taught me that." He smiled, remembering her countless acts of kindness over the years, even when they barely had enough for themselves. Robert leaned forward, his businessman's composure cracking slightly. "We really appreciate this. I know we're far outside the normal service area. Most drivers wouldn't have come out in this weather." "Family emergencies don't care about service areas," Michael replied, remembering countless nights when Wei had needed emergency room visits, and strangers had shown unexpected kindness. Those experiences had shaped his view of what mattered most in life. They passed Linda's diner, now dark and closed. The streets were getting worse, but Michael's knowledge of the city's maze-like shortcuts was proving invaluable. Where other drivers might have given up, he pressed on, drawing on years of experience navigating Boston's notorious weather. "Look, kids," Emma pointed out the window, trying to lift their spirits. "The snow makes everything look magical, doesn't it?" Her attempt to create normalcy in the crisis touched Michael's heart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lucy and Tom pressed their faces against the glass, momentarily distracted from their worry. Michael smiled, remembering similar moments with Wei, finding beauty in difficult times. Sometimes the smallest distractions could provide the biggest comfort. The taxi's wheels slipped again on an icy patch. Michael handled it expertly, but he could feel the vehicle struggling against the elements. The storm was winning, but they were close now, just a few more miles to Cambridge Hospital. Through it all, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this night was different somehow. Maybe it was the way Robert kept checking his phone with increasing urgency, or how Emma's designer coat seemed at odds with their current situation. But mostly, it was the familiar pull of destiny he'd felt only a few times before, like the day he'd decided to become a taxi driver, or when he'd chosen to stay in Boston despite better opportunities elsewhere. What Michael didn't realize was that every mile driven through this blizzard was leading him toward a crossroads, His choice to help this family, made with no expectation of reward, would soon open doors he never knew existed. But for now, he focused on the road ahead, guided by the simple belief that helping others was its own reward. As they neared Cambridge Hospital, the storm intensified. Snow piled up faster than the plows could clear it, and visibility dropped to mere feet. Michael's taxi crawled forward, its headlights barely penetrating the white wall ahead. His years of experience were being tested to their limit. "Almost there," he assured the family, though concern crept into his voice. The hospital's emergency entrance was just a few blocks away, but these last minutes might prove the most challenging. His phone vibrated again, probably Wei or his mother, but he couldn't afford to check it now. Every ounce of his concentration was focused on keeping the taxi moving safely through the treacherous conditions. Robert received another call, his face lighting up in the dim cabin. "Yes, we're almost there," he spoke rapidly. "How is she?" The tension in the car peaked as everyone waited for news. "Thank God," he finally breathed. "She's stable. They've moved her to intensive care." Emma broke down in relief, hugging her children closer. Even the kids seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, their small faces relaxing slightly. The taxi's tires struggled against the deepening snow. Michael could feel the vehicle wanting to slide sideways on the slick surface. He'd driven in bad weather countless times before, but this storm was different. This was the kind of night that would be remembered in Boston's weather history. Just then, his engine made an ominous sound. The temperature gauge was climbing despite the frigid air outside. Michael's heart sank. He knew that sound all too well. The taxi was overheating from fighting through the heavy snow. "No, not now," he muttered, watching the gauge rise further. Steam began seeping from under the hood. They were still 2 blocks from the hospital. Robert leaned forward, noticing Michael's concern. "Is something wrong?" "The engine's overheating. We need to stop." Michael pulled over carefully, trying to find a spot where they wouldn't get stuck. "The hospital is straight ahead, about 2 blocks. You should be able to walk it from here." Emma looked out at the blizzard, then at her children. The wind howled outside, carrying sheets of snow past their windows. Walking would be dangerous, especially with 2 young kids, but they had no choice. "I'll help you carry the children," Michael offered, already pulling on his gloves. He knew his taxi would need time to cool down anyway, and he couldn't leave this family to struggle through the storm alone. Robert tried to protest. "You've already done so much. We can't ask you to." "You're not asking," Michael interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm offering." He thought of Wei again, of all the times strangers had stepped up to help them when they needed it most. They prepared for the walk, bundling the children as best they could. Michael gave his scarf to Lucy, whose own had been left in their broken-down Tesla. The wind hit them like a physical force as they stepped out of the taxi. Michael carried Tom while Robert took Lucy. Emma walked between them, holding onto her husband's arm. The snow was deep, nearly to their knees in places, but the hospital's lights guided them forward. Those 2 blocks felt like miles. Michael's arms ached from carrying Tom, who had buried his face in Michael's jacket to escape the biting wind. Behind them, his taxi disappeared into the swirling snow, its hazard lights creating a faint orange glow. When they finally reached the emergency entrance, all 5 of them were covered in snow. Hospital staff rushed out with wheelchairs, helping Emma and the children inside. Robert turned to Michael, his face red from the cold. "I don't know how to thank you," he began, but Michael shook his head. "Just go be with your family," he said. "Your mother-in-law needs you." Robert hesitated, then pulled out his wallet. "At least let me pay you for—" "The meter's still running at the taxi," Michael said with a small smile. "Go. Family comes first." As Robert hurried inside, Michael stood for a moment in the swirling snow, watching through the hospital windows as the family reunited with their relatives. He saw Emma hugging an older woman who must have been her sister, the children being wrapped in warm blankets by nurses. The scene stirred memories of his own hospital visits, his wife's final days, his mother's ongoing treatments, Wei's childhood emergencies. Sometimes it felt like life's most important moments happened in places like this, where hope and fear walked the same corridors. Turning back toward his taxi, Michael began the long walk through the deepening snow. His phone had several missed calls from Wei and his mother, and one from Kevin Park. He should call them back, let them know he was okay. But first, he needed to check on his taxi. What he didn't know was that his night of helping others was far from over, and the consequences of his actions would soon return to him in ways he could never have imagined. Michael's return journey to his taxi was a battle against the elements. The wind seemed to have doubled in strength, driving snow sideways with enough force to sting his exposed face. His wet clothes from the previous trek were beginning to freeze, making each step more difficult than the last. When he finally reached his taxi, the engine had cooled enough to restart, but something didn't sound right. The familiar purr he'd grown accustomed to over years of driving was replaced by a concerning rattle. He managed to maneuver it to a nearby parking garage, knowing it wouldn't make it much further in this condition. Finally sheltered from the storm, Michael pulled out his phone. 6 missed calls from Wei, 4 from his mother and 3 from Kevin Park. He called Wei first, his fingers still numb from the cold. "Dad." Wei's voice was a mixture of relief and worry. "Where are you? We've been so worried. The news says it's the worst storm in 20 years. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he assured her, his voice tired but warm. "Had to help a family get to Cambridge Hospital. Their grandmother had a stroke." There was a pause on the line. "You drove all the way to Cambridge in this, Dad? They're closing the bridges." Someone had to help them, Wei. They had young children. He could hear his mother's voice in the background, asking questions in Mandarin. "Put Grandma on?" His mother's concerned voice filled his ear. "Xiaoming, why do you always have to be the hero? Your medicine." "Mom, I'm fine." He switched to Mandarin, his voice softening. "Some things are more important than medicine. You taught me that, remember?" After reassuring them both that he'd find a way home safely, Michael ended the call and assessed his situation. The taxi's engine problem was worse than he'd initially thought. Even if the streets were clear, which they weren't, driving it would risk permanent damage. He called Kevin Park, who answered immediately. "Michael, where are you, man? I've been calling everywhere. Parking garage near Cambridge Hospital, taxi's not doing well. Think it might be the head gasket." Kevin whistled low. "In this storm? That's at least $1,000, maybe more. Want me to try coming to get you?" Michael looked out at the worsening storm. "No, stay home, I'll figure something out." He ended the call, slumping back in his seat. The repairs would clean out what little savings he had left. Wei's college application fees, his mother's medication, everything would have to wait. The thought made his chest tight with worry. Just then, a luxury SUV pulled into the garage, its headlights illuminating his taxi. To his surprise, Robert Anderson stepped out, now wearing a heavy winter coat. "Mr. Zhang, thank goodness you're still here." Robert approached, looking relieved. "I've been checking every garage in the area. When you weren't in your taxi, we were worried something had happened." Michael rolled down his window. "Is everything okay? Your mother-in-law?" "She's stable," Robert smiled. "The doctors say getting her to the hospital so quickly made a huge difference, but that's not why I'm here." He glanced at Michael's taxi. "I heard the engine on our way in. Sounds like trouble." Michael nodded reluctantly. "Nothing I can't handle." It was a lie, and from Robert's expression, they both knew it. "My driver can take you home," Robert offered, gesturing to the SUV. "And I insist on paying for your taxi's repairs. It's the least I can do after what you did for my family tonight." "That's very kind," Michael said carefully. "But I couldn't accept—" "Mr. Zhang," Robert interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "Sometimes accepting help is as important as giving it. Besides, I haven't even paid you for the fare yet." Before Michael could protest further, Robert's driver was already loading his essential belongings into the SUV. The warmth inside the vehicle was a stark contrast to his freezing taxi. As they drove through the storm, Robert was quiet for a while before speaking. You know, Mr. Jang, it wasn't just the ride tonight. It was how you helped us stay calm, how you encouraged the children. Not many people would have done what you did. Michael watched the snow swirling in the SUV's headlights. I just did what anyone would do. Robert shook his head. No, you didn't. We called every taxi service in Boston. You were the only one who came. That says something about who you are. What Michael didn't know was that Robert Anderson had spent the time at the hospital making calls not just about his mother-in-law, but about the taxi driver who had risked everything to help them. What he had learned about Michael Jang's reputation in the community had only confirmed his initial impressions. They pulled up outside Michael's modest apartment building. Robert handed him an envelope. The fare plus something for the repairs. And Mr. Jang, expect my call tomorrow. I think we might have something to discuss. As Michael watched the SUV disappear into the storm, he had no way of knowing that this was just the beginning. The next day would bring a proposition that would change not just his life, but the lives of countless others in ways he could never have imagined. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having exhausted itself overnight. Boston lay under a thick blanket of pristine snow, the city temporarily transformed into a winter wonderland. Michael sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the envelope Robert Anderson had given him the night before. He hadn't opened it yet. Wei and his mother were still sleeping, exhausted from worrying about him during the storm. The morning sun streamed through their apartment window, making the envelope gleam almost accusingly. His taxi's keys lay beside it, useless until he could afford the repairs. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Michael sipped his morning tea, a habit he'd inherited from his mother. His phone buzzed, a text from Kevin Park. How bad is the damage? Want me to look at it? Before he could reply, another message came through, this one from an unknown number. Mr. Jang, Robert Anderson here. Hope you made it home safely. Would like to meet today to discuss a business opportunity. Are you available this morning? Michael read the message several times, wondering what kind of business someone like Robert Anderson could possibly want to discuss with a taxi driver. He glanced at the still unopened envelope, then at the family photo on his wall. Him, Wei, and his mother at Wei's 16th birthday last year. Yes, I'm available, he replied, adding, Thank you again for the ride home last night. The response came quickly. Excellent. Linda's Diner in an hour? I remember passing it last night. Seems like a place you know well. Michael smiled, despite his uncertainty. Linda's had been his refuge for 15 years, a place where he could always count on a friendly face and a hot cup of coffee between fares. I'll be there. Wei emerged from her room just as he was putting on his coat. Dad? Where are you going? Your taxi's still at the garage. Meeting someone, he said, picking up the envelope. About a business matter. His daughter's eyes narrowed with concern. Is everything okay? I heard you come in late last night, and I saw the repair estimate Kevin sent. Michael hugged her, remembering how much she'd grown up since her mother passed. Everything will be fine. Study hard today. Those college essays won't write themselves. The walk to Linda's was peaceful, the morning sun making the snow-covered streets glitter. City plows had already cleared the main roads, though massive snowbanks testified to the storm's intensity. As he approached the diner, Michael finally opened the envelope. His hands trembled as he counted the contents. There was enough there not just for the taxi repairs, but for Wei's college applications and his mother's medication. A note inside read simply, Thank you for reminding me what really matters. R.A. Linda was quiet when he entered, the morning rush not yet begun. Linda Wu looked up from behind the counter, surprise crossing her face. Michael, I thought your taxi was in the shop. It is? He replied, sliding onto his usual stool. Meeting someone. Linda poured his usual coffee without asking. Must be important to get you here without wheels. Oh, and that story about you is all over the morning news. What story? She pointed to the small TV in the corner. A local news reporter stood in front of Cambridge Hospital, talking about the previous night's storm. One of the few acts of heroism during last night's historic blizzard, a local taxi driver braved dangerous conditions to help a family reach their critically ill relative. Michael's protest was interrupted by the diner's door opening. Robert Anderson entered, now dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, looking nothing like the desperate father from last night. He spotted Michael and smiled warmly. "Mr. Zhang," he extended his hand. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of doing some research after we parted last night." They settled into a quiet booth, Linda bringing coffee for Robert and a fresh cup for Michael. Robert placed a sleek laptop on the table, opening it to reveal what looked like financial projections. "What I'm about to propose might sound unusual," Robert began, "but please hear me out. I'm the CEO of Anderson Technologies. We've been developing autonomous vehicle systems for years. But last night showed me something our tech has been missing: the human element." Michael listened, confusion evident on his face as Robert continued. "You see, we can program cars to navigate streets, but we can't program them to make the kind of decisions you made last night, to see beyond protocols and recognize when rules need to be bent for the greater good. You're someone who understands what transportation means to people in crisis. Someone who knows every street in Boston, who can make split-second decisions about safety versus necessity. Someone who puts others first, even at personal cost." He slid a document across the table. "I'm offering you a position as Director of Community Operations for our new initiative. Full salary, benefits, and most importantly, the chance to help others the way you helped my family last night." Michael's hands shook slightly as he looked at the offer letter. The salary was more than he'd ever imagined making, but something else caught his eye: a clause about educational benefits for dependents. "Ways College," he whispered. Robert nodded. "Full coverage for your daughter's education and comprehensive medical benefits that would cover your mother's treatments. But that's not why I want you for this position. I want you because you understand what we're really offering people, not just rides, but hope." The morning sun streamed through Linda's windows, making the snow outside glitter like diamonds. Michael thought about all the nights he'd spent driving through Boston's streets, all the people he'd helped, all the stories he'd been part of. What he didn't know then was that this moment would not only transform his life, but would eventually change how cities across America thought about community transportation. The real journey was just beginning. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Michael's taxi was repaired, courtesy of Anderson Technologies, though he wouldn't be driving it much longer. The news story about his snowy rescue had gone viral, with local stations requesting interviews that Michael politely declined. His mother, upon hearing about the job offer, had cried tears of joy, whispering prayers of thanks in Mandarin. Wei's reaction, however, had been the most memorable. When Michael told her about the educational benefits, she'd stared at him in disbelief before pulling out her laptop and showing him something she'd kept secret: acceptance letters from several top universities, including her dream school. "I didn't want to tell you," she'd explained, tears in her eyes. "I knew we couldn't afford them, and I didn't want you to feel bad." They'd held each other for a long time after that, both understanding how much their lives were about to change. The Anderson Technologies office was a gleaming tower of glass and steel in downtown Boston, a far cry from the familiar streets Michael had navigated for 15 years. On his first day, Robert personally showed him to his new office, a spacious room with views of the city he knew so well. "This is the core team you'll be working with," Robert said, introducing him to a group of engineers and project managers. "They know the technical side, but they need your expertise on the human element." Michael spent his first week learning about Anderson Technologies' autonomous vehicle systems. The technology was impressive, but he could see what Robert had meant about the missing human touch. The engineers could program cars to follow traffic rules perfectly, but they couldn't program compassion or judgment. "Tell us about difficult decisions you've made as a driver," one of the engineers asked during a planning meeting. "Times when following protocol wasn't the best choice." Michael thought for a moment. "There was a time I picked up an elderly man from his doctor's appointment. The route algorithm would have taken the highway, but I knew he was nervous about fast traffic. I took side streets instead. It took longer, but it was better for him. The team took notes eagerly. This was exactly why Robert had brought him in, for the knowledge that couldn't be found in any manual or data set. Kevin Park visited him at the office one afternoon, whistling at the impressive surroundings. "Look at you, Mr. Executive," he teased. "Don't forget us little people." "Actually," Michael said, showing him some plans on his computer, "I wanted to talk to you about joining us. We need experienced drivers to help train our AI systems and to handle situations technology can't." Linda Wu's diner became their unofficial meeting spot for community outreach. Local drivers gathered there to share their experiences and insights, which Michael's team used to make their systems more human-centered. "The goal isn't to replace drivers," Michael explained to a skeptical group. "It's to create a network that combines technology with human expertise. Sometimes people need a computer to get them from point A to point B, but sometimes they need a person who understands what they're going through." Robert's vision began taking shape under Michael's guidance. They developed a hybrid system where autonomous vehicles handled routine trips, while human drivers focused on sensitive situations, medical transport, elderly assistance, family emergencies. Every driver in the program was trained not just in vehicle operation, but in crisis management and emotional support. The first test runs of their community transit program exceeded expectations. Michael insisted on riding along personally, watching as their vehicles navigated Boston's streets with both technological precision and human understanding. One evening, as he was leaving the office, he saw Emma Anderson in the lobby. She was there for a board meeting, but she stopped to chat. "My mother asks about you all the time," she said warmly. "She calls you her guardian angel." Michael smiled, remembering that snowy night that felt like a lifetime ago. "How is she doing?" "Much better. She's back to watching the kids twice a week." Emma paused. "You know, that night could have ended very differently if you hadn't come for us. Robert and I talk about it often, how one person's kindness can ripple out and affect so many others." Looking around at the busy lobby, at the plans taking shape under his guidance, Michael understood what she meant. His decision to help one family on a stormy night was now growing into something that would help thousands. What he didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. The real impact of his work, and the ways it would transform urban transportation across America, was still to come. The journey from taxi driver to transportation innovator was just the first step in a much bigger story. As spring bloomed in Boston, the Community Transit Initiative was ready for its official launch. The program had grown far beyond its original scope, incorporating ideas and experiences from drivers across the city. Michael's office walls were covered with maps and feedback charts, each representing a piece of the complex system they'd built. The transformation from his old taxi's cramped interior to this spacious office still felt surreal some days. Wei had been accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship, thanks to the educational benefits from Anderson Technologies. She'd begun helping with the project's social media presence, bringing a younger perspective to their community outreach. Her posts about the program's impact were gaining attention nationwide, with each story reaching thousands of people who saw themselves in the struggles and triumphs she shared. "Dad," she said one evening, showing him her laptop, "look at these responses. Other cities are asking when we're expanding to their areas." The comments section was filled with stories from people facing similar transportation challenges in their communities. "There's a woman in Chicago who missed her daughter's wedding because she couldn't find reliable transport to the venue. A man in Seattle who had to quit his job because he couldn't get to his dialysis appointments." Michael's mother had also become an unexpected asset to the program. Her experience as both a senior citizen and a regular medical transport user provided valuable insights. She'd become something of a surrogate mother to the entire development team, often bringing home-cooked Chinese meals to late-night planning sessions. Her dumplings had become legendary among the staff, and she used these moments to share stories about transportation challenges faced by her friends in the Chinese community. Robert called an all-hands meeting one morning in the main conference room. The wall-to-wall windows offered a panoramic view of Boston, the city that had shaped Michael's understanding of community transportation needs. The room was packed with engineers, drivers, community coordinators, and data analysts, a diverse team united by a common purpose. "The pilot program has exceeded our wildest expectations," Robert announced, displaying charts of their first-month results. "Emergency response times are down 40% in covered areas. Patient satisfaction is at 98%. But most importantly, we're hearing stories every day about lives being changed. We're not just moving people. We're giving them back their independence, their dignity, their ability to be there for life's important moments." He played a video compilation of testimonials. A single mother described how the service had helped her get her child to late-night emergency care when traditional ambulance services were overwhelmed. An elderly man talked about finally being able to make his dialysis appointments without burdening his family. Each story reflected the human touch Michael had insisted on maintaining, the perfect blend of technological efficiency and human compassion. "This isn't just about transportation anymore," Robert continued, his voice filled with emotion. "We're creating a community support network, and it all started because one taxi driver chose to help my family on a snowy night. That decision, that moment of choosing humanity over convenience, has sparked something revolutionary." The room erupted in applause, but Michael remained humble. He knew the success came from everyone's contributions, from Kevin Park's experienced driver network to Linda Wu's diner serving as their community hub. Every person in that room had added their own piece to the puzzle. After the meeting, Michael received an unexpected visitor in his office. It was Sarah Chen, the city's director of transportation, a position that made her one of the most influential figures in Boston's infrastructure development. "Mr. Zhang," she began, settling into a chair, her expression both professional and warmly appreciative. "What you've built here is remarkable. The mayor's office has been monitoring your progress, and we'd like to discuss a public-private partnership. What you've created isn't just a service, it's a model for the future of urban transportation." The proposal was ambitious. Integrate the community transit initiative with the city's existing transportation infrastructure. It would mean access to public resources and the ability to help even more people. Sarah spread out a series of documents on Michael's desk, each outlining different aspects of the potential partnership. "We've never seen anything like this," Sarah explained, pointing to their success metrics. "The way you've combined technology with human insight, it's revolutionizing how we think about urban transportation. Your system doesn't just move people, it understands them." Later that day, Michael took a walk through the city, retracing his old taxi routes. He passed the spots where he'd picked up countless passengers over the years, each corner holding memories of people he'd helped. His old taxi service area had become the testing ground for a transportation revolution, but the streets still felt as familiar as ever. Linda's diner was busy when he stopped in, but she made time to chat, just like she had during his taxi driving days. The place hadn't changed, still serving as a gathering spot for drivers and locals alike. "Your project's all anyone talks about anymore," she said, pouring his usual coffee. "Did you hear about Mrs. Rodriguez? Your service got her to her grandson's graduation when her car broke down. She was in tears telling me about it. Said it reminded her of how you used to help people back in your taxi days. Same spirit, just bigger scale now." "It's not just my service," Michael insisted, warming his hands around the coffee cup. "It's everyone who's contributed their experiences, their ideas, every driver, every dispatcher, every community member who shared their story." Linda smiled knowingly, the same smile she'd given him on countless late nights when he'd stopped in for coffee between fares. "But it needed someone like you to bring it all together, someone who understands that transportation is about more than just getting from point A to point B. It's about people's lives, their dreams, their needs." Michael's phone buzzed with a message from Robert. "Major news networks want to cover our story. Your story. Ready to share it with the world?" Looking around the diner at the familiar faces of drivers and dispatchers who'd become part of his extended family, Michael realized how far they'd come from that snowy night. The simple act of helping one family had sparked something larger than himself, something that was changing lives across the city. He thought about all the nights he'd spent driving through Boston's streets, wondering how he'd make ends meet. Now, he was leading a program that was changing lives across the city. But more importantly, he was showing that technology and humanity could work together to create something truly meaningful, something that preserved the human touch while embracing innovation. What he didn't know was that the next phase of their journey would take them far beyond Boston's city limits. The ripple effect of that snowy night was about to become a wave of change that would transform transportation systems across the country. The real story was just beginning, and Boston was just the first chapter. News of Boston's community transit initiative spread rapidly across the country. Michael found himself traveling to different cities, sharing their model with transportation officials and community leaders. Each presentation began with the story of that snowy night, but expanded into a vision of how technology and human compassion could work together. Wei accompanied him on many of these trips, now handling the initiative's strategic communications as part of her summer internship. Her social media updates had created a following of thousands who were invested in the program's growth. She had her father's gift for storytelling, but with a modern twist that resonated with younger audiences. "Tell them about Mrs. Patel, Dad," she would suggest during presentations. It was one of their most powerful stories. An elderly woman who had missed countless doctor's appointments before their program provided her with reliable transportation and a caring driver who spoke her native language. Robert Anderson had kept his promise about letting Michael run the program his way. When large corporations approached with buyout offers, Robert stood firm. "This isn't about profit," he would say in board meetings. "It's about changing lives. Michael's vision is what makes this work." One rainy morning, Michael received an unexpected call from the White House. The president's staff had been following their success in Boston and wanted to discuss implementing similar programs nationally. They were particularly interested in how the initiative had reduced healthcare costs by ensuring patients could make their appointments. "We'd like you to present to a congressional committee," the aide explained. "Your program could be a model for national transportation policy." Michael sat in silence after the call, looking at the framed photo on his wall, his old taxi covered in snow from that fateful night. Robert had commissioned the picture as a reminder of where it all began. Later that day, he gathered his core team in the conference room. Kevin Park, now Director of Driver Relations, was there with Linda Wu, who had become their community outreach coordinator. His mother sat in her usual spot, taking notes in her meticulous handwriting. "Washington wants to take our program national," he announced. "But before we agree, I want to make sure we can maintain our values at that scale. We're not just a transportation service. We're a community lifeline." The team spent hours discussing how to preserve their human-centered approach while expanding. Linda suggested creating regional hubs based on their diner model, places where drivers and community members could connect face-to-face. "Remember when you used to take extra time with elderly passengers, helping them with their groceries?" Linda reminded him. "That's what makes this special. We can't lose that personal touch." Kevin had already begun developing a training program for drivers nationwide, emphasizing both technical skills and emotional intelligence. "Every city has its Michael Jangs," he said. "We just need to find them and give them the tools to help others." Wei presented data showing how their approach had improved health outcomes, reduced emergency room visits, and strengthened community bonds. "The numbers tell a powerful story," she explained. "But it's the individual stories that make people understand why this matters." As they planned the expansion, Michael insisted on maintaining their core principles. Every driver would be trained in crisis management and cultural sensitivity. Technology would support human judgment, not replace it. And community feedback would drive continuous improvements. The congressional presentation was scheduled for the following month. Michael worked late into the night preparing, wanting to convey not just the program's success, but its heart. His mother brought him dinner in his office just as she had during his taxi driving days. "You've come so far," she said in Mandarin, watching him practice his presentation. "Your father would be so proud." Michael smiled, remembering his father's words about never giving up. "He taught me that success means nothing if we don't help others along the way." The night before flying to Washington, Michael visited his old taxi garage. It was now a training center for their program, but some things hadn't changed. The smell of motor oil and coffee still lingered in the air, and drivers still gathered between shifts to share stories. A young driver approached him, looking nervous. "Mr. Zhang, I just wanted to say thank you. This program gave me a chance to help people while supporting my family. Last week I helped a man get to his daughter's wedding." The look on his face when we arrived on time. "That's why we do this, right?" Michael nodded, remembering countless similar moments from his own driving days. The technology had changed, the scale had grown, but the essence remained the same. One person helping another through life's important moments. What he didn't realize was that his upcoming testimony would catalyze a national movement, transforming not just transportation, but the way America thought about community care. The story that began on a snowy night in Boston was about to inspire change across the entire country. The congressional hearing room buzzed with anticipation. Michael sat at the testimony table, Way and Robert beside him, facing a panel of senators and representatives. The room was packed with transportation officials, healthcare advocates, and media representatives from across the country. Michael began his testimony not with statistics or technical specifications, but with the story of that snowy night. His voice steady and clear, he painted a picture of a struggling taxi driver choosing to help a family in need, not knowing it would lead to a transportation revolution. "But this isn't just my story," he continued, gesturing to the packed gallery. "It's about every person who's ever needed help getting to a doctor's appointment, a job interview, or a family emergency. It's about combining technology with human compassion to ensure no one gets left behind." Way presented their data, showing how the program had reduced emergency room visits by 35% in Boston by helping patients maintain regular medical appointments. Healthcare costs had dropped significantly in areas served by their initiative. But more importantly, community surveys showed stronger social connections and reduced isolation among elderly and disabled residents. "What makes this program different," Robert explained to the committee, "is that we didn't just create a transportation service. We built a community support network. Every driver is trained not just in vehicle operation, but in understanding human needs." The questions from committee members were probing but supportive. A senator from Michigan shared how her own mother struggled with transportation after giving up her driver's license. A representative from California described similar initiatives starting in his district, inspired by Boston's example. During a break in the testimony, Michael stepped into the hallway for some water. He overheard two senators discussing the potential impact of implementing the program nationwide. "This could transform healthcare access in rural communities," one said, "and create thousands of meaningful jobs." Back in the hearing room, Michael shared stories that brought the program's impact to life. He told them about Mr. Johnson, a veteran who had nearly given up on his physical therapy appointments before their service provided reliable transportation. About Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who could now take her child to medical specialists without losing her job. "What we've created in Boston," Michael concluded, "is more than a transportation solution. It's a model for how technology and human connection can work together to strengthen communities. Every city has its own challenges, but the basic human needs are the same everywhere." The committee chairman leaned forward. "Mr. Zhang, what would you need to implement this program nationally?" Michael shared their carefully prepared expansion plan. Regional training centers would preserve their human-centered approach. Community advisory boards would ensure local needs were met. Technology would adapt to each city's unique characteristics while maintaining their core principles. "We don't want to replace existing services," he emphasized. "We want to complement them. filling gaps and ensuring no one falls through the cracks. After the hearing, reporters surrounded them in the Capitol hallway, but Michael's attention was drawn to an elderly woman waiting patiently with her daughter. "Mr. Jang," the daughter said, "we watched your testimony. My mother hasn't been able to visit her grandchildren for months because she can't drive anymore. Hearing about your program gave us hope." That evening, in their hotel room, Wei showed Michael the social media response to his testimony. Transportation for All was trending nationwide, with thousands sharing their own stories of transportation challenges and hopes for change. Robert joined them for dinner, bringing news that several state governors had already reached out about pilot programs. "This is bigger than we imagined," he said. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Michael thought about his journey from taxi driver to national transportation advocate. He thought about all the lives they could touch, all the communities they could help. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the potential for positive change. "As long as we remember why we started," he replied, "it's not about building the biggest program, it's about helping one person at a time, just like that night in the snow." What Michael didn't know was that his testimony would be remembered as a turning point in American transportation policy. The ripple effect from one taxi driver's kindness was about to become a wave of change that would transform communities across the nation. As autumn painted Boston's streets in vibrant colors, the Community Transit Initiative was expanding across the country. The first wave of pilot programs launched in 5 major cities, each adapting the Boston model to their unique needs. Michael divided his time between overseeing the national rollout and ensuring their original program maintained its personal touch. Wei had turned their expansion into her Harvard thesis project, analyzing how different communities adapted the program. "Every city has its own character," she explained during a team meeting. Chicago focused on weather emergencies, Miami on senior services, Seattle on healthcare access, but they all keep Dad's core principle: people first, technology second. The Anderson Technologies office had grown to occupy 3 floors of their building. Michael's original team now led different aspects of the national program. Kevin Park headed driver training nationwide, while Linda Wu developed the community hub model that each city would follow. Even Michael's mother had an official role, consulting on senior citizen services. "Remember when you worried about affording my college applications?" Wei asked one evening, as they watched the sunset from Michael's office. New photos lined his walls now. Launch ceremonies in different cities, testimonials from grateful families, teams of drivers graduating from their training program. Michael smiled, remembering those difficult days. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed. But you know what hasn't changed? The reason we do this." A notification popped up on his computer, a live feed from their Chicago launch. On the screen, a driver was helping an elderly man through the snow, looking remarkably similar to that fateful night in Boston. The same scene was playing out across the country, hundreds of times each day. Robert called an emergency meeting one morning. The president's transportation secretary had reached out. Congress was drafting legislation based on their model. The Community Transit Initiative would become a framework for national transportation policy. "They want to create a federal grant program," Robert explained, "helping cities implement our system. Michael, they want you to help write the guidelines." The conference room erupted in excited chatter, but Michael raised his hand for silence. "Before we agree, I want to visit each of our pilot cities. We need to make sure we're not losing our way as we grow." Over the next month, Michael traveled across the country, riding along with drivers, visiting community hubs, and listening to local residents. In Chicago, he met a driver who kept extra blankets in his car during winter storms. In Miami, a coordinator had organized a network of bilingual drivers to serve the elderly Cuban community. Seattle had adapted their technology to account for the city's unique geography and weather patterns. Each city added its own flavor to the program, but the essence remained the same: people helping people, supported by technology, but never replaced by it. Michael took careful notes, determined that the federal guidelines would preserve this balance. Back in Boston, he worked late into the night drafting recommendations. Wei brought him dinner, just as his mother used to do during his taxi days. "Dad, look at this," she said, showing him her phone. Their drivers across the country had started a tradition of sharing stories from their shifts, inspiring each other to go above and beyond. Linda Wu organized a community feedback session at her diner, now one of many such hubs nationwide. Drivers, passengers, and community leaders gathered to share their experiences and suggestions. Michael sat quietly in the back, listening to how his simple act of kindness had grown into a movement. "Last week," one driver shared, "I helped a woman get to her chemotherapy appointment. She told me that before our program she'd had to choose between paying for treatment and paying for transportation. That's why this matters." The federal guidelines were finalized just as winter returned to Boston. Michael stood at his office window watching snow fall on the city streets below. Somewhere out there, drivers were helping people through the storm, just as he had done that night 2 years ago. What he didn't know was that the program would eventually serve millions of Americans, creating a new model of community-based transportation that would inspire similar initiatives around the world. But for Michael, success wasn't measured in numbers or legislation. It was measured in the simple moments of human connection that happened in vehicles across the country, one ride at a time. The story that began with a taxi driver's choice on a snowy night had become a blueprint for change, proving that even the smallest act of kindness could transform countless lives. 5 years after that snowy night in Boston, the Community Transit Initiative had become a cornerstone of American transportation infrastructure. Cities from Portland to Miami had adopted their model, each adding unique elements while maintaining the core principle of human-centered service. Michael's simple decision to help a stranded family had sparked a nationwide revolution in how communities thought about transportation and care. Wei graduated from Harvard with highest honors, her thesis on the initiative's social impact earning national recognition. She joined the organization full-time, heading up their innovation department while pursuing her master's degree in urban planning. "You taught me that success means nothing if we don't help others," she told her father during her graduation ceremony. "I'm just following your example." The original Boston operation had grown into a comprehensive community support network. Linda Wu's Diner was now one of hundreds of community hubs across the country, places where drivers gathered to share stories and support each other. The walls were covered with photos of lives touched and moments shared, each telling a part of their ever-growing story. Kevin Park had developed a driver training program that became the industry standard, emphasizing both technical skills and emotional intelligence. "We don't just teach people to drive," he would say during training sessions. "We teach them to care." Michael's mother, now in her 70s but still active in the organization, had become a beloved figure among drivers nationwide. Her dumplings were still legendary, but more importantly, her wisdom helped shape their approach to serving elderly and immigrant communities. Robert Anderson had kept his word about preserving the program's integrity. When profit-focused investors pushed for automation and cost-cutting, he stood firm. "Our success comes from our humanity," he would remind the board. "That's not something you can automate." One cold December morning, almost exactly 5 years after the night that changed everything, Michael received a special visitor in his office. It was Tom Anderson, now 11 years old, accompanied by his father Robert. "Remember that night in the snow?" Tom asked, pulling out a worn piece of paper. It was a child's drawing of a taxi in a snowstorm which had hung in Michael's old office. "I drew this right after you helped us get to Grandma. Mom says that's when everything changed." Robert smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Tom's been asking to visit. He wants to tell you something." The boy stood straight, suddenly serious. "I decided I want to help people too. Dad says when I'm older I can intern here and learn how everything works. Is that okay?" Michael felt his eyes grow moist. Of course it's okay. That's what this is all about, inspiring others to help. Later that day, Michael visited the driver training center that had once been his taxi garage. A new class was graduating, ready to join the growing network of community drivers. Among them was the son of a woman he'd helped years ago, completing a circle of kindness that kept expanding. The program's impact went far beyond transportation. Studies showed significant improvements in healthcare outcomes in communities they served. Social isolation among elderly residents had decreased. Employment rates had risen as reliable transportation removed barriers to work. But for Michael, the most meaningful measures of success were the small moments. A grandmother making it to her grandchild's recital, a patient getting to their dialysis appointment, a family reuniting in times of crisis. Each story added to the tapestry they were weaving across the country. During the annual Driver Appreciation Dinner, now a nationwide event held simultaneously in cities across America, Michael listened as drivers shared their experiences. A young woman in Seattle described helping a veteran get to his wife's funeral. A driver in Miami told of organizing a neighborhood support network for homebound seniors. Each story echoed the spirit of that snowy night in Boston. "We've created something remarkable," Robert said during his speech. "But we never forget where it started, with one person choosing to help others, regardless of the cost. That's still who we are, no matter how big we grow." What Michael couldn't have known on that winter night was how far a single act of kindness could reach. The ripples of his decision had touched millions of lives, creating a model of community care that would continue to grow and evolve for generations to come. The true legacy of the Community Transit Initiative wasn't in its size or success, but in the countless moments of human connection it facilitated every day. It proved that even in an age of advancing technology, the most powerful force for change remained the simple choice to help others in need. 10 years after that fateful snowy night, Michael Jang stood at the podium of the National Transportation Innovation Awards. The audience included transportation leaders, community organizers, and drivers from across the country. His family sat in the front row, Wei, now running her own branch of the initiative, his mother proudly wearing her community advisor badge, and even Linda Wu, who had helped turn her diner model into a nationwide network of community hubs. "A decade ago," Michael began, his voice steady but emotional, "I was a taxi driver struggling to make ends meet. On a snowy night, I made a choice that seemed simple at the time, to help a family in need. What I didn't know was that this choice would change not just my life, but the lives of millions of Americans." The Community Transit Initiative had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. Over 5,000 communities across America had adopted their model. Their driver training program had created over 100,000 jobs. Healthcare costs in served communities had dropped significantly. But more importantly, they had proven that technology and human compassion could work together to transform lives. Robert Anderson, now silver-haired but still actively involved, joined Michael on stage. "When I met Michael that night, I was just a desperate father trying to get my family to the hospital. What I found was someone who reminded me what really matters in business and in life: putting people first." The ceremony included a special announcement. The Anderson Foundation, in partnership with multiple universities, was establishing the Michael Jang Community Transportation Fellowship. Each year, it would support students developing innovative solutions to transportation challenges while maintaining the human-centered approach that had made their program successful. "The first recipient," Wei announced proudly, "is Tom Anderson, who was just a scared little boy in a snowstorm 10 years ago. He'll be working on expanding our program to rural communities while studying urban planning at MIT." Michael watched as Tom, now a tall young man, accepted the fellowship. He remembered the boy's drawing of a taxi in a snowstorm, which still hung in his office. The circle of kindness kept expanding, generation to generation. Kevin Park, who had trained thousands of drivers over the years, shared stories from across the country. A driver in Montana who organized a volunteer network to help remote communities during winter storms. A team in Arizona that developed a specialized service for Native American reservations. Each story added to their collective legacy. Linda Wu's community hub model had evolved into a nationwide network of support centers. "We don't just move people from place to place," she explained. We create connections, build communities, restore dignity. That's what Michael taught us all those years ago. The initiative had sparked similar programs around the world. Delegations from Europe, Asia, and Africa had visited to study their model. Michael had traveled to share their story, always emphasizing that success came from maintaining the balance between technological efficiency and human touch. As the ceremony concluded, Michael's mother took the stage. Speaking in Mandarin with Wei translating, she shared her perspective as both a participant in and advisor to the program. "My son learned early that we rise by lifting others," she said. "This program proves that one person's kindness can change the world." Looking out at the audience, Michael saw faces from every chapter of their journey. The engineer who had helped design their first dispatch system, the marketing team that had shared their story with the world, drivers who had been with them since the beginning, now training the next generation. 10 years ago, Michael concluded, I was just trying to help one family through a storm. Today, we help millions of families through their personal storms, medical emergencies, family crises, daily challenges. But we never forget that each ride is more than a journey from point A to point B. The worn steering wheel under his hands brought back memories of countless nights driving Boston streets. The simple choice he'd made that snowy evening had set in motion changes he could never have imagined. But sitting there, Michael knew that their work wasn't finished. As long as there were people who needed help getting to life's important moments, their mission would continue. The story that began with one taxi driver's choice had become a testament to the power of human kindness, proving that the smallest acts of compassion could transform the world in ways we never expected. In the end, it wasn't about the awards or recognition. It was about the simple truth Michael had learned on that snowy night, that sometimes the most important choice we can make is to help others, even when it isn't convenient. That lesson, more than anything else, was his true legacy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.